The fact that he went through something that was extremely traumatic, extremely painful, and when we see him being redeemed by King David, it's in the most gracious and merciful way, all the way up to the point where he gets to sit at the king's table. What's up, geeks? It's your guy Q here, aka JGTV, and we are back with another one, guys. And today we are still talking about Truama, but we are going to be focusing in on Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth was Saul's grandson, Jonathan's son, and he is somebody who David redeemed after Jonathan and Saul were killed in war. So let's get right into it. So Mephibosheth is not someone who we hear a lot about in the Bible. If you actually go to 2 Samuel chapter 9, that's where you can begin to read about him, because it kind of talks about Mephibosheth and David. What I like most about Mephibosheth is because he's not talked about so much. We don't really know a lot of the trauma he faced, but it actually was a good amount, and his redemption story is pretty dope. So what it starts out is Saul and Jonathan, which is his father Jonathan and his grandfather Saul, are in battle, right? They end up dying while they're in battle. A servant that is babysitting or watching Mephibosheth at the time hears about it and is in fear that they're going to come after the young boy. So she takes Mephibosheth and she tries to flee to a different town, a different country. So while she is running with him, she drops him, and he's about 5 years old at the time. And I guess the way he falls, he becomes lame in both of his legs. So clearly that's a huge traumatic event in Mephibosheth's life, right? Because from this point off, he is described as a lame man. So time passes on. He actually ends up living in a country called Lodabar, and he does have a young son called Micah. At some point when David takes the throne, he asks one of his servants, is there anyone from the house of Saul that's still alive that I could show kindness to? And one of the servants talk about Mephibosheth, and they kind of describe Mephibosheth right off the bat based off the traumatic event that's happened in his life. So we got to catch this, right? Because so often people will try to name us after incidences or things that have happened in our life, even after God has redeemed us, or even when God has a plan to redeem us. So this is how they name Mephibosheth. They say, yeah, Saul has a grandson, Jonathan has a son who lives in Lodabar, but he's lame in both of his feet. So David sends for him. When David sends for Mephibosheth, Mephibosheth is extremely afraid, but he shows a reverence to David, and he pays respect to him, homage to him as king. And David tells him not to be afraid, and then he tells him, like, hey, I'm going to restore back to you everything that was your grandfather's. I'm going to give you all of this land. And in that time, you know, land was as good as money is today. So he basically restored him, and then Ziba, who was Saul's servant, he tells Ziba, like, hey, you're going to now serve Mephibosheth. And Ziba had 15 sons at the time and a whole house full of servants. So all of these people end up being Mephibosheth's servants. So even after this traumatic event in his life that then later on led to more traumatic events in life, to where he probably couldn't get the type of job he needed, probably couldn't provide for his family the way that he wanted to. He ended up living in a place where he would never live if he hadn't been lame in both feet and running from some people. You know, he gets extremely restored, and on top of that, David tells him, from now on, you're going to eat at my table. So Mephibosheth had suppers, like 8 dinners and feasts with David at the king's table. You know, this was an extreme sign of respect that David could give to Mephibosheth, even though he didn't have to. I mean, sitting at the table with the king was a big deal, you know, so he gets to do this, a man who's lame in both of his feet. And I mean, from here on in, you know, his life is pretty good. I mean, at some point, you know, Ziba does betray him, which is another traumatic event when David is fleeing from the kingdom and Absalom is trying to take it from him. But when Mephibosheth meets back up with David, when David is returning to Jerusalem, you know, David just tells him, hey, I want you to split everything you have with Ziba. So at the end of the day, he still didn't lose everything, but Mephibosheth still had a couple of traumatic events happen in his life. But when we hear the story about Mephibosheth, the very first thing we hear about is the great redemption story that God gave him. The fact that he went through something that was extremely traumatic, extremely painful, and when we see him being redeemed by King David, it's in the most gracious and merciful way, all the way up to the point where he gets to sit at the king's table. And I think that we can take a lot from this, because as a man who was disabled, life was probably really, really hard for him. We know it was. We see in the New Testament and the parables that people are telling. We see Jesus telling his disciples about the lame man and the blind man. And so people with disabilities during this time, and even in the time when Christ was with his disciples, it was just extremely horrible. It was almost like you were cursed to have some type of disability. In fact, they actually believe that you had this disability because you did something in your previous life and you were paying for it in a current life you were in, and that's why you were disabled. So horrible stigmas around people who were disabled. So to see this happen to a man like Mephibosheth, this is a great redemption story for any of us who have experienced traumatic events that dealt with us maybe ending up disabled or it leading up to a disability. Maybe we weren't always disabled and we became disabled. Maybe we weren't always deaf and we became deaf. Maybe we weren't always blind and we became blind. And we see that God still saw this man, and he still uses King David to redeem him in a great way, that till this day we see it. When it's preached, it's just a story of inspiration, right? Exhortation. It's extreme encouragement to see that something like this can happen to a man who went through such traumatic events. So you guys be encouraged by this, because even all the way up into a disability, missing limbs, having limbs that are lame, God still was able to restore this man in a great way and give him a life that he never thought he would actually have. Because when he approaches King David, he's like, who am I that you would just pay attention to such like a dog like myself, you know, like a nobody like myself? And that's when David doesn't even answer him. He doesn't even pay attention to what Mephibosheth says about himself. He just calls the servant over and says, hey, you and your servants are going to serve Mephibosheth. And I love this story. So you guys be encouraged by this. Remember that God can use you regardless of anything that you have gone through, you're dealing with, or you will deal with. And just share this with anyone who may be dealing with a disability, has dealt with a disability, or has been treated wrongfully because they are disabled. I want all of you guys to be encouraged. So stay tuned, because the next person with traumatic events is coming up. I'm not going to reveal it. You got to stay tuned for that. Take care of yourselves, guys. And what do I always say? Love yourselves, love one another, but most of all, love God. Peace.